does it mean for an authoritarian regime like a Russia, or maybe a China to be more realistic, to build their own game engine that is sort of state-controlled, state-sponsored, and what are the implications on that?
Hi friends, welcome to the Metacast Roundtable by Naavik. Today I'm joined by my Dion, lead product manager at EA and contributor at Naavik. And we're on a roll with new guests. Today we have Tammy Levy. Gosh,
Levy.
Did I screw that?
Levy.
Oh,
it's
no.
Yeah.
Oh. This is forever recorded. Chief Games Officer at Captain.tv. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Do you have like a 30-second intro about what you do?
Yeah. So, as Maria said, I'm Tammy Levy. I am the Chief Games Officer at Captain TV. We're a smallish startup building what we call streamer-led games. So it's all about social interactions and really enabling streamers to connect with their community and doing that through games. So it's a very interesting space that we're exploring and trying to build out. So a lot of exciting design spaces to explore for us. Before being at Captain TV, I spent 8 years at Congregate. And I did a bunch of different things at Congregate, from user acquisition, product management, analytics. My last role there was as chief product officer. So that's me.
That sounds really exciting. So streamers, someone who's watching a stream can play the game or influence?
Yeah. So you have, if you join a streamer-led game, usually how it goes is right now the kind of like the framework that we have for our games is the streamer, we call them captains, hence Captain TV, and they're kind of leading the charge. Like the one game that we have live, it's called Streamer Eaters, and they're like leading the charge as they're like going down these dungeons and like clearing the dungeons. So they place their big unit, and then their audience all rallies behind them and plays all their little units, and then the battle plays out. That's just one example, but really is about kind of those interactions instead of kind of being broadcast streamer to audience all the time with like very minimal interaction just through chat, is creating a more meaningful connection and interaction between the streamer and their community.
Wow, that could be a topic in itself. I'm very curious, but we have a full episode, so I can't ask further questions. Maybe on a next time. And just to get to know you a little bit better, you have a dog?
I used to have a dog. You'll see him in a lot of my social media and my profile pictures, because he was. I came to realize that my little senior dog was just always in my pictures. So I was like, sure, I'll just like embrace that. So we lost him a few months ago, but his name was Jasper, and I'm more than happy. He was a joy. So I'm more than happy to talk about him.
I'm so sorry.
He was 17 years young when he passed a few months ago.
Wow.
And we adopted him when he was 12. So we experience his retirement. Everyone's like, oh man, I want to have a retirement with you, live my retirement with you, because he had a wonderful retirement with us.
Was he like a party senior, or was he a chill relaxation retiree?
He was like both, a little bit of both. Once he came out of his shell, he liked to chill, but he also liked to. He was an introvert for sure. So it took him like a little bit to like warm up to people, but once he did, he could be a riot and like loved playing. And he was a nerdy dog, we say, because he loved solving puzzles. So we ended up buying like the most difficult like puzzles, and like he would go all out on solving them.
Wait, what do you mean by puzzle? So I've never seen a dog solve a puzzle.
A dog puzzle.
We've entered the Metacast section.
Right? It's games for dogs. So the ones that we had for him, and like there's different levels of like difficulty, but it's like, you know, they have to find the treats, and he was also very treat motivated. But you would have to like say like there's like 3 little boxes or like drawers, but they have a lock, so that you have to first like unlock it with the paw and like align it in the right place, then pull the drawer, and then you get the treat. That was the easy one, and there were like two levels of difficulty more that he eventually mastered.
That's so cute. I think I'd find that fun.
Wow.
Like, lock away a
Right?
treat for me, and I like to solve that puzzle.
Right, and try to find it.
Yeah.
Take five different steps to get your treat. It just, you know, tastes way better.
Let's pivot Captain TV. Let's do human treat puzzles.
Human treat puzzles.
Streamer
Yeah.
Ledge.
Yeah.
And what's a game that you recently churned from? Do you remember?
That's a great question, and I'm going to talk about a game that I haven't churned, that I churned and then I just reactivated, and it's Pokemon Go.
Ooh.
And I've had like this roller coaster relationship with Pokemon Go of like playing a lot, churning, something gets me back to it, playing a lot, churning. So I went through like that last cycle of like playing a lot. And then I was like, I'm done with this. I'm so tired. Like it's just collections. Like I'm done. And I was like, I'm gonna move it out of my home screen, just like get it out of my view, and I'm done with it. Like churning for real. The problem is that I every time I've gotten my partner into like the let's play a lot, he's like way more he gets like way more obsessed, and like he's way more completionist than I am. So the social pressure, man, the peer pressure, social pressure, he'd be like, come on, we're on the same team. I need someone else to defend this gym with me. And he just like started slowly pulling me back into it. And then we were traveling and I was walking a lot. And I was like, well, if I'm going to be walking a lot, I want to get cracking those eggs from Pokemon Go. And then once you get cracking those eggs, you're like, well, I got to spin those stops because I want like the gifts and the postcards and like, and now I'm back in full swing with Pokemon Go after a 2-month hiatus of I'm never touching this again.
Wow. Well, that's the power of Pokemon. That's great when a game manages to associate something like a long walk to a moment to reactivate you. That's so smart.
Yeah. I mean, it's because it felt like a missed opportunity, right? Like first 2 days that we were traveling, I didn't have like the adventure sync because it's like what counts your distance without you having to open the app. It's like I was like, and no adventure sync when I was like, I'm churning. So I was like, I don't want you reading my data. All about the data privacy there. And I was like so upset. I was like, man, I missed 2 days of like walking. I was like, okay, it's fine. I will enable adventure sync again.
Well, maybe in a few months you can tell us again if you're still on the go.
I'm sure I'll be churning, especially when the winter hits. But
oh yeah.
We'll cross that bridge when we get there.
No one noticed my pun. I'm really sad. You know, you're on the go because it's Pokemon Go.
That's a good one. Too smooth. You were too smooth.
Sorry. Matt, what do you think about Elon Musk saying that Tesla is making progress with the Steam integration? Are you looking forward to playing games in a Tesla?
No, I don't have a Tesla, and I don't have many friends who have Tesla. Any, I guess my boss has a Tesla, but I don't often drive with him, and so I'm comfortable with my Steam at home. I'm comfortable with my Xbox. I'm not particularly excited about it. I think he has bigger fish to fry, honestly, than putting Steam in Tesla.
Spoken like a true product manager. Should be lower down.
It's like, what's the opportunity cost of this?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I'm really excited about just this quick snippet of news. The Warframe studio, Digital Extremes, they're making a new free-to-play fantasy MMO. I love Warframe, and so I'm even more pumped to play a fantasy version. And they called it Soulframe. Warframe? Soulframe? Yeah. Anyway, it's inspired by Princess Mononoke, which is my favorite Miyazaki movie as well. So yeah. Hopefully, I don't know when it's coming out. They just announced that they're doing it. So hopefully sometime next year.
I was going to say probably like 2024.
No. Okay, I'll hold off being excited about this. All right, well, we'll just jump into the topics. Today, we're going to be talking about the highlights and pitfalls of letting players choose your content. Russia is preparing to fund its own national game engine, and we're also going to talk about the Unity and the ironSource merger, which should be a spicy topic. Who's excited for the topics today? Okay.
Let's get into it.
All right, I'm actually bringing the first topic, which is the highlights and pitfalls. And this is based on Old School RuneScape's polling system. I know it's been talked a lot when there are discussions about DAOs and Web3 games. Just a quick disclaimer, I used to work at Jagex, but everything I'm about to share is public knowledge. It's all in an NME article that was written by Andy Brown recently. And as a bit of context, Jagex develops two RuneScape MMORPGs, one called RuneScape 3 and one called Old School RuneScape. RuneScape 3 continued to evolve. Old School RuneScape was reignited with the nostalgia from the players who used to play the 2007 version of the game. It's really cool to go check it out. It's low poly. Yeah, it's very nostalgic, to be honest. I used to play it when I was younger, so I really like delving into it once in a while. It's also available on mobile. So Old School RuneScape decides whether the updates are going to go live based on player polls, and it has to reach a 75% yes criteria for it to be released. RuneScape 3 does not use a polling system. I think it all started when Old School RuneScape were deciding whether to bring something, I think PvP back into the game. It was something about the game. And they ran a poll and the poll passed. And that's where it all started in terms of that community. And some of the benefits of the polls that were mentioned is that it adds quality to what's being released because it passed a player poll. And the polls are actually quite detailed in terms of the design documentation. It also makes the game unique because there is no game out there with the scale and longevity of Old School RuneScape that permits players to have like such control over the game's content. And it also allows players to permit the game to evolve because it was brought back with the nostalgia of a very specific year that the game that existed. And the player base, it shows that the player base is still committed to keeping the game growing over time. And then just quickly, some challenges of having polls is that some players, like the counterpart of that benefit is that players can be very attached to the nostalgic feeling and the design at the time. And so they might block content that is more futuristic, even in its design style. So I imagine it must be really hard for the game designers to have to keep one foot in 2007 and then the other foot designing for 2022. It can also be difficult to reach 75% of acceptance when you're talking about something that's a bit niche. One example is the PvP content. Players don't like to be killed. And so if there's something that will increase PvP or make it better or make it harder for players to defend themselves, it can be very hard to reach just group consensus. And so that niche player base could be affected and not have content. I think they experimented or are experimenting with restricting polling to players who play a certain mode to try to make that more fair, but apparently that brings its own challenges, and I can imagine so. And then it's also really difficult for developers who are super passionate about an idea. You see the data, you see a pain point, you think, ooh, this would be a really good solution, but then it's actually quite a high acceptance criteria with a 75%, and then just for 1% of something that you're really passionate about, it just gets lost. So I can imagine it's difficult to handle that loss in a way. So the thought that I was having about this article is first to bring it back to the DAO style decision making. And I know, Matt, you wrote an essay about this a few months ago. So I was actually thinking, could we see more games, for example, blockchain games, bring player decision based on a polling, such as Old School RuneScape, rather than a DAO style? So the differences being polling, the content is still generated by the game dev team. So you understand what you want to do with the game, what problems to solve, what the high level design is, and then you propose it and you see if you get that acceptance or feedback. Contrary to a DAO style where anyone in the DAO that owns governance tokens, they can propose something for the game, and then if it passes, it's just introduced to the game.
I think you could still have a little bit of both. You could. I think it comes down to how your DAO and your tokens are designed, right? Like, what governance rights are you granted with your tokens? It could be just as you described, Maria, where only the developers have the right to propose a topic for voting, and then you, as a DAO member, by owning that token, have voting rights, but you might not necessarily have proposal rights. You could also do something in between where, like, you need a certain amount of tokens or a certain class of tokens that lets you also propose. And maybe there's some gating behind that, like you need to be vetted by the community or vetted by the developers, or I don't know. I feel like there's solutions to kind of bridge that gap between sort of traditional polling, where it's all very centralized, and completely decentralized. And as you pointed out, like, there are all sorts of challenges and problems to having something that's completely decentralized, or even putting things up for a vote to begin with. That's my kind of quick take. I'm curious to hear what Tammy has to say, like, working on games that are by nature very participatory. Like,
yeah, no, I think it's super interesting, and I was really like thinking about the specifics of this topic, and like how the RuneScape team has been able to manage it, because there's a lot of teams, and even Captain TV, like, we talk about like community first and building with the community and building games with the community, and that can look many different ways, and just seeing kind of like this longitudinal example, right? Because like DAOs are just getting started, right? Like, they've been around here and there, but for games, like, we haven't hit this point where like you're live up, like you're doing live ops with a ton of games and a ton of examples that have DAOs, as far as I'm aware. So I think it was a very interesting thought exercise for me. Like, how do you keep that balance between ensuring you do right by all players? And you could argue that by you as the developer proposing what changes should be made to the game, which updates should come to the game, you're thinking about like the broader user base. How do you balance that with letting the community that wants to be vocal be vocal? Because I think like that's always been the challenge, and that continues to probably be like the challenge that I've experienced is you're always going to have like a vocal percentage of your community, and it's like it's a vocal minority. And how do you best balance that? And I think like DAOs kind of address it from one angle. Polling probably addresses it from another, if it's like easy enough to like participate and not have to like think too much about it, and you're just like passionate about the game and just go and share your opinion about what should and shouldn't come into your turf of your game. So it was, I think that what Matt's saying is like, it is an interesting point of, balancing and keeping kind of like a little bit of both intents of, being able to opening up for the community, like what do they think would be good, and having like very clear avenues to do that. Because I think like that also is where a lot of like community frustration can come up. It's like, they mention, hey, we need this is broken, we want this, and developers being like, yes, we hear you, and then nothing happens, right? So having like better avenues for that, as well as like, hey, are you on board with this big update? And I think it just creates like much longer engagement for sure. So I think it's, it's something that I've been just thinking a lot about in general. And I think it's just like continues, like it's a thing that continues to evolve, I think, for me. And I'm also very curious to see how like a lot of like the games in the Web3 space that are implementing like DAOs, like how they start handling these challenges. And you pointed out a lot of the challenges that the RuneScape's team has run into, because it has its pros and cons.
Yeah, I think the niche audience for different areas of content was really interesting, because I can see exactly that. If you give full democratic decision to a large player base across all of the game content, then unless that population is even in terms of their interests, and if the game is really complex, like an MMO, where something that's good for one part of the player base or content could then make lives harder for other players, that would be hard to reach that kind of consensus. I think if a game decides that this is part of their gameplay, that's what makes it fun. And it could be well, just like Old School RuneScape. It works so well for them, and people are enthusiastic to play the game because they can be part of that journey. As long as people are aware of the challenges that will come with it, it could be part of just the game design from the get-go. I am interested, if I put my product manager role on, I'm interested in the opportunity cost that Matt was saying about the Teslas. There's an opportunity cost. If you invest all of this time in, I want to design this feature and this is what it's going to look like, and then I'm going to pull it. If then that doesn't pass the pull, someone on the team has just spent, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks working on something that then doesn't go through. So there's that added cost as well to the game development that could potentially get easily lost as something that's not tracked.
You mentioned earlier that some of the proposals get really detailed. I was curious if you could elaborate on that a little bit. Like I've not really spent much time playing RuneScape. I don't know what level of detail they go into. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
I can only say it gets really detailed, like with images and explaining all the context around it. It's almost a complete game design doc that gets shared with players. And
yeah, like I wonder, are the players equipped to understand like the full ramifications of proposing a new system? I know that probably sounds like very condescending. Like some players are really invested in the game and they know exactly how all the systems work, and some players may be more casual. Yeah. You also pointed out like people have different agendas or points of view. Like, an elder player may have different interests than someone who plays once a week but is really deep into, I don't know, PvP combat or something like that. Like they're only going in a specific direction. So there's different factions of players and their ability to like synthesize the information. And then finally, like, are they going to even vote? Are they going to participate? Or are they going to take the time to read the documentation? So there's like all these different kind of ways that this could go in unintended directions, not necessarily good or bad, just like not knowing. I think the same problems manifest themselves with DAOs.
Do you think that something like this would work best with like elder games? Like basically, because as we're talking about it, right? It's like players having an impact on their game and like having like this very like long-term investment in the game. Like you really get that understanding of the game and kind of like that ability to actually know the game better than sometimes like the game developers. Probably once the game's out for like, over 3 years for sure, right? Like we're talking like longevity here. And it feels like it's a system that best serves kind of games in that stage and maybe like as you're like exploring new concepts. So maybe I'm like on a prototyping type phase But it feels like there's like this time period where, it might not be as beneficial, at least to that rigor of polling, not building with building the community, yes, but like that rigor of polling, it just feels like it's much more suited for like this kind of elder type, very loyal user bases.
Yeah, I think that makes absolute sense, actually. I haven't thought about that because RuneScape already existed. They took a game that already existed and then took an older version and then started branching it off into his own game. So it was a game that already had an audience, it had a history, and then shaping the future and not starting from a new game. That's a very interesting perspective. And in terms of, Matt, you asked, do players fully understand the design document? And I don't remember the exact criteria, but not everyone can vote. I think you have to be at a certain stage of the game to be able to vote. And yeah, it was honestly amazing how these players, like, they've been playing for so long. They know the game in and out, every mini game, every section, every strategy. And sometimes, because you have someone who's played the game, I don't know, 12 years or something, they have 12 years of knowledge of the design and the balance. And then you have someone on the team, I don't know, maybe they joined a year ago. That's still not enough to gain those 12 years of knowledge of the game. And so I imagine that potentially, some players could understand the design and the implications better than the game devs.
I completely agree with this notion that it's better suited for elder games. Where this gets interesting with the DAOs conversation is that the voting is often conferred through tokens, right? And I can sell those tokens to someone else. Even if I put in 100 hours, I can just say, I'm tired of this game. I'm going to sell these voting rights to someone else. And then it kind of, it changes the way that works. Also, kind of counter to the idea of elder game applications is that, just by nature of the sort of cycle of crypto that we're in, all of these games are new. They're all brand new. And so they're doing these, the ones that are doing it, like DAO enforced voting, they're doing it at the very earliest stages of development, where I could still see it working. It just depends how you apply it. Like, maybe it's more about the aesthetic, the world building, the lore, and it's less about the mechanics of the game and how our tokenomics are going to work or something like that. But it will be interesting to see how it all plays out with this sort of Web3 application.
Yeah, especially with like the token granted voting rights, right? Like you can end up with like a very powerful majority dictating like the direction of your product, right? Like it is distributed, but like it's not distributed evenly in any way or form. So that's going to shape your product very much towards like, whichever portion of your game you're enabling like that voting for, that is going to be very much shaped by that powerful majority, which might or might not be an even distribution of your broader user base.
I'm really curious for someone to do it in the industry and see what happens. Would I do it? Especially if I'm bootstrapping or starting a company, would I have the courage to do it? Probably not. But I hope someone out there has the courage so that we can see what happens. And before we move on to Matt's topic, I know that some of my Jagex friends listen to this, and I just want to say I miss you. All right, Matt.
All right, so I'm going to take things in a different direction here. I saw this article sometime last week. It's from PC Gamer, and they're talking about how the Russian state is advocating for the creation of a national game engine to rival Unity or Unreal. Specifically, we're talking about a few Russian tech companies and politicians. VKontakte is one that's kind of like the Russian Facebook. They also have a games presence. Rostelecom, which is their state telecom provider. These were some of the bigger names that were mentioned. And this was kind of in response to a lot of the Western tech companies pulling out of Russia post-invasion of Ukraine. So that's kind of the summary of the story, is that they're looking to set up a national game engine, or at least advocating for it. My first reaction, and I suspect the reaction of many others who read this, was to kind of shrug it off and say like, this will never happen. Unity, Unreal, Epic Games, these companies are so far ahead of someone that would be starting from scratch to make a new engine. Like this is not an easy thing to do. There's a lot of R&D that goes into it, a lot of investment. And so this was my first reaction, was like, oh, it's kind of like a harebrained idea. But I thought about it a little bit more. And especially in the context of all these, I'm going to use the word metaverse conversations recently, and the importance of the game engine in that tech stack for creating digital experiences. I was sort of thinking about like the long-term implications of a totalitarian state actor controlling this key piece of the tech stack, as the world is increasingly spending more and more time in digital spaces, online. And what does that mean for sort of control, for privacy, things like that. In doing the research, digging a little bit deeper into the sources that these articles referenced, there was a German report that talked about, it's a quote here, Russia's quest for digital sovereignty, which at a high level has two goals. One is technological independence, which I mentioned earlier as the sort of decoupling from EU and American tech companies. And the second goal is information control, which if you follow international politics about Russia or other similarly minded nations, the control of information or propaganda, depending on your point of view, is really an important part of how they kind of maintain their power. And so, what does this mean? Like in Russia, are they going to be able to pull this off in the next few years? I don't know. I'm skeptical, but it's not really about competing in business terms. It's more about like, if they continue at this, if they continue to develop something like this and they're sort of forcing adoption. And by the way, it's not just games. Like game engines are being increasingly used in other applications, film and television, architecture, engineering, automotive applications. There's all sorts of ways that game engines are being used more and more. So what does it mean for an authoritarian regime like a Russia, or maybe a China, to be more realistic, to build their own game engine that is sort of state-controlled, state-sponsored, and what are the implications on that? So I wanted to kind of propose this topic and see what you all think. Am I being, am I catastrophizing here? Is this like, am I projecting too far out into the 1984 vision of things, or am I right to be concerned a little bit?
It's very interesting. So as you were talking about it, the first thing that came to mind, and I don't know if you guys watched it, was Extra Credits on YouTube did an episode a few years back on propaganda games, and how the dangers, I think it was like the true dangers of gamification, and they talked about a lot about the social networks in China specifically, like, the gamification of like all your activities and, really influencing your behavior as we live more and more in this connected world in like social networks and social media, right? And like gamifying there from like gaining points if you like the right things within, the feed. Losing points if you're associated to the wrong people, and that having impact on your life, right? Like maybe you don't get access to, the best jobs if you don't have a good enough score. And if we go into like Black Mirror territory, right? Like we're getting towards that, but it really reminded me of that. And I think like that's, I don't necessarily think that you're catastrophizing. Sorry. But I just feel it's an interesting move because the talent is there to build the technology. Like it's not like they don't have the talent to build it. Now is the talent, and is there the motivation there, however that motivation comes from or wherever it comes from, to build the technology and then use it, right? Having games built in that technology or a metaverse or whatnot. But I think like the implications of something like this working out, I don't think are like far-fetched. The question for me is more like, the building it itself, and then, is some team from there going to build like this metaverse type, or they're going to assemble a team to build this metaverse type space, because it does feel like more complex than social networks, right? Because both Russia and China have their own social networks, and I think like that's a I would say like a prototype of this. But a social network, I would argue, is much easier to build than like a game engine, and then build games in a metaverse on top of that game engine. So all that is to say is like my reaction was like, man, there's like a very like Black Mirror future that you can like start going into if you think about like the implications of something like this working out. The question for me is like, would they get there in terms of like building all of those building blocks?
I think so. And we're not that far off from the Black Mirror future. I believe China's A/B testing already a social credit score in that regard. I believe that the presence of humanity in the digital world is just an accepted fact, that's where we're going towards. And I also believe that the way that we manage the world outside of the digital, so I don't know, the physical world probably is a good description, I believe governments will want to try to mirror that within the digital world. And if we look at other countries, I don't know, like Western countries, we're more comfortable with companies, corporations, having quite a lot of control over our society, whether that's by having so-called monopolization of services, limiting our choice, the consumer choice, lobbying governments. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's just how it is. And then we have other countries where they don't want to depend on third-party, international, even national companies to have that kind of control. And so they want to privatize and have governmental authority over other aspects of life. And I think that will be the same case with the metaverse. And to do that, you need a game engine. And so better start now. China has I believe it's by 2030, they want to be the leading AI innovators globally. And I think the last article I read, they were only about a year behind the United States in that regard. So it's very likely that they will achieve their goal. And if we look at past achievements of just the world, both Russia and China have been able to achieve like marvelous innovations in digital and in engineering, like the space race and all of these things. It seems like no matter what kind of, politics the country follows, you have bright engineers, you have motivated people, and put those two together with a common goal, they will achieve it. And we've seen that being achieved. And I think this game engine will follow the same path if it remains, because it's going to take quite a lot of investment and costs. So as long as the countries remain focused that this is an outcome that they want, I believe that they have all of the skill to achieve it.
The metaverse race, so to speak.
Well, yeah, and I think I was at Develop Brighton, and Brenda Romero did a talk about the Betterverse, and it was all about how we need to be cautious of not bringing the physical world bias into digital worlds. And the outcome of the talk was a bit cynical, and I agree with it. Is it possible? Probably not. And seeing how all of these different companies and countries are trying to build their own metaverses, I think that's an example that we will see the physical world reflected in the digital.
Yeah, and I think that there's a strong case for governments to really like fund this, right? From that point of view, in terms of kind of splitting like Western countries that rely more on like private companies, they're struggling with regulation and, making sure that they have like the right privacy gates, protecting the users, kind of have all of this protection for users as this expands more and more. So, I mean, that's like the perfect, hypothesis and starting point for someone like Russia to be like, well, clearly that's not working. We need to do it differently. And that starts creating like a very focused and like clear mission and like a motivated mission for building something like this.
Yeah, it's not necessarily this dichotomy between like free markets and companies are building it and this monolithic state entity is building it. Like if you look at a country like China, like Tencent, NetEase, these are massive companies with impressive technical capabilities, but they're not like distinct entities from the state either. Like, if you want to play in China, you have to play by the rules, and you could apply the same notion to Russia or any other, nation with a similar mindset, which is like, if you want to access the metaverse from Russia, you have to do it through the Russian game engine, and also, by the way, like it doesn't have to be this, full Ready Player One type metaverse, like the final, whatever vision. It's like there are many steps along the way and many sort of different digital experiences. And it could just come down to, from a Russian or Chinese state perspective, like you just need to access it through our, rules or our portal that we've built in our game engine. And by the way, I should say, like Western companies aren't necessarily great at like protecting users or, being privacy centric necessarily. So I don't mean to make this a one-sided argument. There are problems all around. But I guess the point I wanted to make with this story is that it's less about the business impact to like Epic or Unity and more about like, what does this mean for societies as we move to like a more digital way of living in the future? And what does it mean for governmental control of these digital spaces?
Should we move on to the last topic? Or else we might get too bogged down in politics.
Speaking of game engines, we can jump into talking about the Unity and ironSource merger. And I can give a little intro here. I'm sure that folks have read plenty of news about this and about the deal, but just to summarize it a little bit, I will say that from when I saw the news coming out, the first thing that came to mind, I was like, man, are we like reaching like peak consolidation here? And was ironSource the last, and I'm gonna use air quotes, pure ad network, because they were not pure anymore. Like they had like a gaming arm and whatnot. But I was like, man, are we reaching like peak consolidation? So it's an interesting, consolidation place where we're at right now, but some details on the deal. The deal was for Unity and ironSource to merge, where it's worth $4.4 billion for ironSource. That's a 74 premium on what was valuated at the time. And basically, ironSource will become a wholly owned subsidiary of Unity. Some quick and interesting points. Unity has never really been profitable. I think that they operate at a loss of negative 7%. So on the flip side, what's interesting is ironSource has historically run a profitable business, I believe with above a 30% EBITDA margin. So that's a very interesting marriage that we're talking about, even if Unity is bigger than ironSource. And this EBITDA margin for ironSource they've been able to maintain it even as they've been hit with, all the IDFA headwinds. Another interesting fact is that Unity has had trouble competing in the ad monetization space. they have the inventory and the ad network, and they've acquired ad networks in the past, but they've really have struggled to find their footing with the ad mediation platform. So in that regard, ironSource has a very solid ad mediation platform. Unity doesn't. So in that regard, again, the merger makes sense. And it's also been a very interesting, I would say, roller coaster year for Unity with, they had a very strong Q1. I believe it was like record revenue, 30% up year over year. But even as they, were recording record revenue, they've been lowering their guidance, almost with every board meeting and with every deal announcement, they've been lowering their guidance for the year. And they even hit a layoff round of about 4% of their workforce in June. And their CEO, and this just like kind of like it was interesting that this happened like right after they announced the deal. Like their CEO got in some bad PR with very harsh comments about developers not prioritizing monetization, which was just like interesting. You're seeing like a CEO that supposedly has a lot of experience and is very seasoned make comments like that. So it's all in. It's an interesting deal. The mergers and acquisitions kind of slowed down during Q4 as the markets were kind of cooling. And then, we see a pretty hefty deal here. I think, as I was reading several takes, people have analyzed this, why I think it makes sense. It's, Unity's mediation tool, as I was saying, like is just like really behind. While ironSource's mediation, I think it's called Level Play, has been around for 3 years. It's solid. It works. It has a good customer base that likes it. Their biggest competitor, AppLovin, acquired Mopub, and AppLovin has been very aggressive with their acquisition strategy and have really eaten into the market. So kind of it almost feels like AppLovin like pushed them into a corner to you're the two left big players here, other than our Google and Facebook networks. So it's either do this or can't compete. And in a hypothetical world where it all works well, if the tools are well integrated into Unity, like it can work. Like it can be a good kind of play all in for both teams. Although I'm skeptical, and that's what overall the market and the industry have been very mixed in their reactions. So I'm curious to hear, kind of just, we can dive into like more specifics and about the deal, or like kind of take it a little bit more of like generally speaking about like where the industry trends are going. But I'm curious to hear, from what you guys have read and heard from the deal, like what is your point of view in terms of this pretty big merger?
I think it makes sense. I think it was a key strategic move from Unity and ironSource. Something that bothers me about what happened is how Unity laid off part of their workforce. And so Unity went through some struggles because they ingested bad data. And then I think it's called the audience pinpointer. Their product, it was essentially destroyed, and they were going to have to rebuild it. And so that already hurt Unity's share. And then they announced that they weren't going to lay off anyone. I think the CEO announced that in an all hands. And then about 2 weeks later, they did. And when people were looking at who they had laid off, it was the machine learning, as a lot of machine learning and I believe data science team. And so everyone was just left thinking, oh, wait, they were the people that you needed the most to go and resolve the ingestion of bad data that happened. and rebuild your product essentially. And then they acquired, they had a merger with ironSource, and that explained why people were laid off. And I think what doesn't sit right with me is how they weren't very clear about why they were laying off. And I think other companies were laying off. And from what I heard, a lot of people were blaming it on the recession because of the bad data. They hadn't performed as well. But then, they have the 4.4 billion merger. I'm not blaming anyone. There's just something about it that doesn't fully sit right with how I feel about this. And then on the other hand, I think it's an excellent strategy for Unity, because maybe actually the cost of rebuilding that product, which is critical for their revenue, I believe their services revenue is higher than the engine revenue, is probably more cheap to merge with ironSource. And you already have their ad mediation platform that is successful, get their knowledge. From what I understood, Unity is going to continue to build their own ad mediation platform. I can only assume that maybe ironSource's platform, the ad mediation, could be better. And so that's why now they've joined forces, like Unity, the expertise of Unity with the expertise of ironSource, and building it together to make something better and new to compete in this market that, like you said, AppLovin is very competitive right now. Matt, any thoughts?
I don't know if either of you have used ironSource as product people. I can only speak as like a former user. I found their product to be very good, and like the dashboarding and reporting tools that they had were really good from my perspective as a PM who was working on an ad monetized game. That said, you raised a really interesting point, Maria, which I also picked up on. Shout out to the Invest Game breakdown in Naavik Digest on this topic, where they pointed out that the ad monetization revenue stream, or the segment that includes that, was a much larger proportion of Unity's revenue than their engine services, which is crazy when you talk about, like, one of you mentioned earlier how it was like their ad service was like not great. And so I don't know if they kind of stumbled into that or what. I'd like to give them more credit than that, but it makes sense from that perspective. They're trying to shore up their capabilities in that area. Obviously, it's important to their business. Both companies were getting hammered on the stock markets. They weren't doing particularly well, and the comments from the CEO about developers was like, I get what he was trying to say, but if you think about Unity, like probably most of their developers are on the indie side. They're not doing a ton of in-game monetization. They're certainly not doing ad monetization. Like that's a huge part of their customer base that's using Unity. So I don't know. It seemed like not an ill-advised comment, I'll say.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also have used ironSource a lot as a tool. Unity for admon, not as much. Although I've, a few years back, I did a little bit. From that experience, like ironSource's product is just superior. So it'll be interesting to see if they actually leverage that. In that regard, just looking at it as like very purely like, and this is a pet peeve of mine, but when all of these deals get announced, everything's talked about like synergies to be realized. And I was like, man, where are those synergies? Because very rarely do you see those synergies get realized. So it's going to be, that's where I'm the most skeptical, like similar to you, Maria, like how it's all kind of gone. It's, kind of doesn't sit well. Especially like with Unity being so, such a tool for, trying to reach any type of developer, right? Like you're not talking about like an Unreal Engine where you're like hitting like these very like experienced, bigger teams that can afford a tool like that, right? Like Unity's like vision and mission starting point is like enable any type of team to build games. But that aside, I am very skeptical of seeing the so-called synergies really get realized, especially ironSource. They acquired Tapjoy at the end of last year in October, and they still haven't fully integrated Tapjoy, right? So now you have ironSource integrating Tapjoy, Unity integrating ironSource. It just feels like a little bit of a mess that my skeptical side, it's like, you know, the biggest impact of this deal is that Unity bought some profit, and ironSource was able to give back a little bit of value to their shareholders.
You make a good point. Like M&A is complex, and there's some stat out there. It's like 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 acquisitions ultimately fail, and so it's a big challenge, as you point out, Tammy.
Considering how much of a portion the ad services are to Unity, I'm a bit less skeptical because they'll have to get it done.
They'll be motivated.
And so yeah, they'll be motivated to at least, I don't know, capitalize on some of that synergy one way or the other. What I'm more curious about is what is that going to look like for the developers, for their products. Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. And the whole situation that happened with the CEO, it's just a good reminder of how difficult the role of the CEO is. Because the moment you're in that role, you're so public, and you're essentially representing everyone who's in the company when you're communicating. And I'm sure the grand majority of everyone who works at Unity is lovely and doesn't agree with what was being said. But yes, I can imagine it's quite hard. Everything you say is...
It's not his first go-round
Yeah,
either.
Exactly.
He was the CEO of EA for a long time.
Oh, right.
The other like quick and interesting thing that jumped out at me as I was reading about the deal is that it was really... I found it like funny that one of the things that was highlighted is like that Unity now has a game studio capability, like game studio capabilities. And that is because ironSource has this like little supersonic studio that does like hyper casual games. And for me, it was like such an interesting thing that was like highlighted. It felt like much bigger than it is going to play a role in any way or form. So it's always like interesting to see how the deals get kind of shared and communicated in the PR that goes behind them. That was an interesting tidbit that I was like, just made me like turn my head and be like, huh, it's interesting that you're putting so much emphasis on this.
Well, it could be a positioning against AppLovin, who owns game studios,
right,
for example, Lion Studios, and Unity and ironSource, like, oh, hey, we have some
being like, hey, we're more than AppLovin because we're like an engine and a studio and a network. Boom.
Yeah, because when you do these kinds of announcements, it's also to create confidence with the shareholders and affect the market, hopefully in a positive way. From the last I saw, that hasn't happened with the Unity share price.
Yeah, it actually
the best.
Yeah, I believe it went down a little bit. But do you guys think that we've reached peak consolidation at this point?
No.
More to come, right?
No, more to come. And I think especially with the market and where it's going, we'll see more happening.
Yeah, I think especially if we enter more of a deep recession, we've already seen there's an appetite among like tech giants to step into gaming and acquire gaming companies. There have been plenty of rumors about EA in the past, for example. Ubisoft was another one. We just had Playtika get acquired by, it was like a private equity firm or something. So I don't think it's going to stop. I think it might slow down, and it might be like bigger companies at lower frequency.
Yeah.
But I don't remember if it was
Aaron or Manu, but they said that the Playtika majority share acquisition might actually be fake news. So that, yeah,
Oh, okay.
I don't know if that's been fully confirmed. But I agree with everything that you said.
Yeah.
And that takes us to the end of today's episode. That was a mix of interesting topics. Thanks, Matt. You've been bringing some thought-opening topics in the past couple of roundtables you've been attending.
Sure. Happy to help.
And
Happy to
Tammy,
join.
thanks for joining for your first episode.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. This is fun.
I changed your surname pronunciation in my document with Portuguese letters so that I pronounce it correctly next time. I'm going to be put to the test. And if you want to join the conversation, you know where to find us. We're in the Naavik Discord. Also, sign up to the free newsletter, Naavik Digest, where you can, for example, read Invest Games report on the Unity ironSource merge. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next week. Bye, everyone.